Hick. I have stood at the back of the Alderton Civic Concert Hall for 38 years. I have watched soloists and orchestras and school choirs in semi-final competitions. I have watched a principal cellist faint mid-bow, a child prodigy forget his piece, and walk off the stage without a word, a soprano hold a high note so long that 2 rows of the stalls simply began, cry. In 38 years I thought I had seen everything this hall had to give. I had not. Not until the night of the spring charity concert, when a young woman in a cotton work jacket sat down at our Steinway and did something I have never been able to adequately explain to anyone. Not my wife, not my daughter, not even my colleagues who were standing 20 feet away. They were there. They watched it happen. And still, when we try to describe it to each other, we end up going quiet. The evening was a fundraising concert for the Hospital Restoration Fund. Black tie, champagne at the interval, the mayor in the front row. The program was the usual: a string quartet, a local tenor, piano soloist named in the printed notes as a graduate of the National Conservatoire. Polished, proper, exactly the kind of evening where nobody is surprised by anything. She arrived with our head of housekeeping, Mrs. Bellamy, a woman who has kept this building standing for 22 years and who I would trust with my life. The girl was her niece, apparently, visiting from the north. She was perhaps 22. She wore dark trousers, a neat white shirt, and a light cotton jacket the color of old stone. Plain work clothes, the kind you keep clean but cannot mistake for occasion wear. She had the look of someone accustomed to using her hands. Capable, steady, not easily rattled Mrs. had brought her along as a guest and introduced her quietly at the side door. I showed them both to 2 seats in the upper gallery. I thought nothing more of it. The interval arrived. The patrons spilled into the foyer, champagne glasses, printed programs, the hum of satisfied self-congratulation. It was then that a board member named Gerald Farrow, a man in his late 60s who chaired the concert society, and who had a talent for locating the one person in any room who did not belong, found the girl near the stage door. She had wandered back in while the hall was emptying, drawn, as I later understood, by the Steinway. She was standing near the lip of the stage, not touching anything, just looking at the piano, the way some people look at cathedrals. Farrow noticed her. He took in the jacket, the plain clothes, the way she had no champagne glass, no program. "Are you with the catering staff?" he asked her, loudly enough that a small knot of patrons nearby turned their heads. She said she was Mrs. Bellamy's guest. Farrow's expression did not change exactly, but something in it settled into a kind of jovial contempt. "Can you play?" he said. And it was the sort of question that is not really a question. He was nodding toward the Steinway the way a man might gesture at a chessboard in Someone He Takes to Be a Child. A few of the nearby patrons smiled. I watched from the side aisle. I said nothing, which I am not proud of. The girl looked at the piano for a moment. Then she said, yes. There was a small, expectant pause, the kind that precedes something people think will be briefly amusing. Farrow gestured with an open hand as if to say, well then. The small cluster of patrons settled into comfortable amusement, glasses in hand. She climbed the 3 steps to the stage, smoothed the back of her trousers and sat down. She adjusted the bench, about an inch closer, no more. She placed her hands in her lap for just a moment, looking at the keys without touching them, and the hall was suddenly much quieter than it had been a few seconds ago. I cannot explain why. Something changed in the air. She began with Debussy, the opening bars of the first arabesque, that quiet, descending curl of notes, nothing showy about the entry, just a clear statement of intent. A few patrons in the foyer heard it and drifted back to the doorway. The arabesque runs only a few minutes. By the time she reached the middle section, the part where the melody begins to turn on itself, climbing and falling, like water finding its level, the foyer had gone almost entirely silent. She did not play it the way a conservatoire graduate plays it, correctly, and at appropriate tempo. She played it as though she had found it, as though the piece were hers, and the hall were simply where she happened to be sitting. Her left hand kept a patience underneath, that her right hand circled away from and always returned to, and the effect, I am struggling for the word, was of something unhurried and inevitable, like watching a river. You knew where it was going. The knowing did not diminish the arrival. The arabesque ended. She did not lift her hands from the keys. She sat for one breath, two, and then she moved into something else entirely. Not Albacissy, not anything I recognized, something she had made. It began simply, a single note line in the right hand, plain and a little lonely, the kind of melody that sounds as though it has been waiting a long time to be played. The left hand came in underneath it. Not chords exactly, more like a slow turning of the earth, steady and deep. The melody above it began to find its way outward, growing not louder but fuller, as though each phrase were learning something the previous phrase had not known. There were moments where she seemed to hesitate, not from uncertainty, but from listening, the way you hesitate before saying something you want to say precisely right. And then the next phrase would arrive, and you understood she had been weighing it, and it was worth the wait. I became aware, at some point, that I was no longer watching the hall. I was watching her hands. They were the hands of someone who worked with them. There was nothing soft or formal about them, and yet the way they moved across the keys was so particular, so completely without waste, that I found myself thinking, this is what those hands were made for. Everything else they had ever done was preparation. The music built, not to a dramatic climax, nothing of the concert hall about it, but to a kind of quiet fullness, as though the piece had been patiently widening this whole time and had finally reached its proper size. I noticed at one point that the patrons who had been standing in the foyer doorway had moved all the way inside. No one had directed them, no one had spoken. They had simply followed the sound, the way you follow a light when a room has been dark. And then, the same unhurried certainty with which it had begun, it drew inward again, the left hand settling, the right hand returning to the single line it had started with, simpler now, a little changed by where it had been. She let the last note stand until it was truly gone. Then she lifted her hands and put them in her lap, the way she had at the start. For a long moment, the hall was absolutely silent, not the polite silence between pieces at a recital. People are preparing to applaud. A real silence, the kind that comes when a room has been stopped. The mayor was standing in the stall doorway with his champagne glass at his side, not drinking from it. The string quartet's first vice was in the wings. I saw her put one hand flat against the curtain, as if she needed to be steadied. Mrs. Bellamy, in the upper gallery, had her face turned away from me, but I could see her shoulders. Gerald Farrow was standing at the foot of the stage steps, where he had remained throughout. He was looking at the piano, not at the girl, at the piano, and his expression was something I had not seen on his face before in all the years I had watched him hold court in this building. He looked like a man doing arithmetic in his head that was not coming out the way he expected. Someone began to applaud. I think it was the first violinist, still in the wings, then the foyer patrons, then the gallery. The mayor began to clap. Then the stalls were doing it, and the sound bounced off the ceiling and the back wall and came back at us doubled. She stood. She turned to face the hall, not theatrically, just straightforwardly, the way she had done everything, and gave a single, brief nod. Not a bow. A nod, as though she were acknowledging something that had happened to all of us equally, and was grateful to have been part of it. She walked off the stage, down the 3 steps, and back toward the side door. I caught up with her in the corridor. Mrs. Bellamy was a few steps behind. I asked the girl how long she had been playing. She thought about it for a moment, as though this were a more interesting question than it might appear. Since I was very small, she said. There was a piano at the community center. Nobody was using it. I asked if she had had lessons. Some, she said. Mostly I just played. I wanted to ask her other things, who she was, where she had learned to compose like that, what she did with the music she made. But something about the way she said it, mostly I just played, made me feel that these were not quite the right questions, that the playing was its own sufficient answer, and the questions were mine, not hers. She and Mrs. Bellamy went out through the side door into the evening. I walked back to my post at the back of the hall. The second half of the concert was about to begin. The conservatoire graduate with his program notes and his polished technique, and as the audience settled, I looked out at that room, 300 people finding their seats, and I thought, they are all carrying the same thing right now. Something happened here tonight, and not one of us quite knows what to do with it. That was 11 years ago. I retired the following spring. I think about it sometimes. The way you think about the best things, not looking for them, just finding them already there. Mostly I just played. I have never forgotten those 4 words, or what came before them.